full today, full of gratitude for the trust you have placed in me, full of love for our country, and full of resolve. The outcome of this election is not what we wanted, not what we fought for, not what we voted for, but hear me when I say, the light of America's promise will always burn bright. As long as we never give up and as long as we keep fighting. Now, I know folks are feeling and experiencing a range of emotions right now. I get it. But we must accept the results of this election. A fundamental principle of American democracy is that when we lose an election, we accept the results. That principle, as much as any other, distinguishes democracy from monarchy or tyranny. And anyone who seeks the public trust must honor it.
As part of yesterday's concession speech from Vice President Kamala Harris in Washington, D.C., as she promised to keep fighting for democracy, equal rights, and the rule of law. Ahead of that speech, Vice President Harris called President-elect Trump to congratulate him. According to a senior Harris aide, the vice president discussed the importance of a peaceful transfer of power and being a president for all Americans. The Trump campaign also put out a statement reading in part, President Trump acknowledged Vice President Harris on her strength, professionalism, and tenacity throughout the campaign, and both leaders agreed on the importance of unifying the country. President Biden also spoke with President-elect Trump over the phone yesterday to congratulate him and to express his commitment to a smooth transition of power. Biden also invited Trump to meet him at the White House, though no date has been set. Biden will address the nation this morning at 11 a.m. regarding the election results. And good morning and welcome to Morning Joe. It's only Thursday, November 7th, Joe. Kind of feels
I thought yesterday was Friday, right? I thought it was like, okay, end of the week. Yeah. Well, no, it was a great. I thought it was a great speech by Kamala Harris. I thought she obviously, for good reasons, still sort of in that campaign mode, and obviously, though she again, I think she hit the marks throughout the campaign and did extremely well. I think she did far better than most people expected her to do at the beginning of that very short and abbreviated campaign. It was such an extraordinarily short and abbreviated campaign. And in the states, you look at, there are a lot of things to look at across the map that you see states like Texas and Florida and Ohio. Those have just gone so deeply red compared to even where they were 4 years ago when Joe Biden was getting closer, certainly in Texas and within 3 or 4 in Florida. But those states are deep red. Ohio, a deep red. Pennsylvania the party registration has gotten far more Republican over the last several years. The races were still close, though, Willie, in Wisconsin, still close in Michigan. Pennsylvania was more like 2 percentage points. We had Democrats winning Wisconsin and Detroit and Michigan yesterday. Pennsylvania's still up in the air right now, but that's looking like that's going to go to Dave McCormick, but it's still very close. But there were such transformational changes in this race yesterday. And, Jonathan asked at the end of his show, where should Democrats go from here? I'd suggest France for a couple of weeks and think it over. 32% of Americans, only 32% of Americans who voted identified themselves as Democrats. Donald Trump won, if I'm not mistaken, I think I saw this in Mike Allen's newsletter, 1 of 3 votes from people of color. And Donald Trump has put together a working class coalition across racial lines that nobody has done in this country in over 50 years. And so, yes, people need to look back at the campaign, and they certainly should feel free to call out Donald Trump for all the things that he said that were shocking and deeply offensive. But if you're a Democrat right now and think that's going to get you elected 4 years from now, it didn't get you elected a couple of nights ago. So it's time for the Democrats to look in the mirror and figure out exactly what went wrong. And I think, Willie, you and I have been talking about it over the last 4 years or so. It shouldn't be really that hard for them to figure out exactly where they went wrong. We'll just see if they're self-aware enough to do it.
Yeah, I mean, this is a massive structural problem now for the Democratic Party. So there's been all this sort of Monday morning quarterbacking about the vice presidential choice and all these things that we traditionally hear. That would not have made a difference. Let's be clear about that. About the shortened campaign, that, of course, was difficult. Kamala Harris didn't have time to introduce herself in a way that, say, Barack Obama did. But the fact of the matter is Donald Trump just wiped out the Democratic Party. You sometimes, as a political opponent, as you know, Joe, you just have to tip your cap to the other side, not for the rhetoric, not for the behavior, but for the way he won. The people he brought into his party, the people who felt they didn't have a home, Latino men, some young black men as well, even women, young people. He did much better with young people than most people expected. And that is a big shift that the Democratic Party has to reckon with. And at this moment, I'm not sure what the way back is for Democrats when you've lost, been wiped out. Donald Trump did better in 48 of the 50 states than he did last time around, despite all the everything that was coming at him. So Democrats need to sit and think about what happened. The question will be, do they have the will to change? Do they have a message that will be appealing to those people that Donald Trump now brought into his coalition?
I hate Monday morning quarterbacking here. I really do. And I don't want this to be taken as a blanket criticism for the people that were running Kamala Harris's campaign, because they were great. Jen O'Malley Dillon, just the best on the ground that there is. She was facing, though, there was a red wave this year. Yeah. The press got it wrong and the pollsters got it wrong 2 years ago. That wave was somewhere out coming off of Africa and moving across the Atlantic and coming. It just took it 2 years more to get here. But, man, it crashed on shore two nights ago. But, Jonathan Lemire, there was some reluctance to go there, to talk about the things that were concerning Americans that really mattered this year. Illegal immigration, the mass border crossings. Yes, they put a bill out there, and yes, that was good. But there wasn't anything more definitive on it than that. That was something that concerned Hispanic voters. It's something that concerned black voters. That concerned something that concerned all voters. We will talk again. We've been talking about the transgender ad that we kept talking about on this show. 30,000 times it ran, over $30 million, and kept talking about it, saying this is going to be a problem in the 3 states that you need. There's a Financial Times article. They don't understand my life. The Trump campaign spent this is Financial Times. Trump campaign spent millions of dollars on political ads focusing on transgender issues in the final stretch of the race. Kamala is for they, them, one said. Trump is for you. Quote, the ads of the transgender stuff were really unsettling to the people, said Deb Dassow, chair of the Democratic Party in Wisconsin's Ozaukee County, a Republican stronghold in the Milwaukee suburbs that broke for Trump. I mean, you don't have to be a Republican, though I was a Republican. You don't have to be a conservative, though I was a conservative, to understand that seeing ad after ad after ad in NFL football games saying that taxpayers were going to be funding transgender surgeries for inmates, it's not something that's going to play well in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, among men. And yet, they just didn't respond to it. because they were afraid to respond to it because it might offend some small subset of their base. And the thing is, nobody's saying to be anything but kind to all Americans. This just had to do with responding to the ad and saying, hey, wait a second, that was Donald Trump's policy that they're attacking. But they wouldn't even do that because, again, they're afraid to offend, always afraid to offend, always afraid to offend on border security, always afraid to offend on so many other issues. They're at 32%, and they have lost working class America. The question is, how long until they understand that this isn't just about tax cuts, this isn't just about economics, this is about cultural markers that matter greatly in these people's lives.
Yeah, this is certainly a lot of second guessing among Democrats that they should have had a more robust response to that particular argument. There's a lot of finger pointing in the party right now. But let's be clear, the President Biden's legislative record robust, but even in real time, his West Wing acknowledged they were slow to address two issues: immigration and inflation. And they feel like they made progress on both, but that was a lasting impression made on voters, and Republicans hammered it home. There's also a similarity here to what we saw in 2016, the first time Donald Trump was reelected, where he appealed to these working class voters who felt like then it was the recovery from the Great Recession, this time around the recovery from the pandemic and the resulting inflation, that they felt it was uneven. They felt it was unfair. The elites continued to do well, but the working class suffered, and we saw that at the ballot box here. Not only did Trump continue to do really well with white working class voters, he made real inroads with Latino voters, as we discussed at length yesterday, a little bit with black voters. He also made modest gains in the suburbs. It was across the board. It wasn't just 48 out of 50 states that he did well in, as Willie mentioned. He improved his marks in more than 90% of the nation's counties. This was across the board, the victory here for Republicans. And for Mika, as for Democrats, Kamala Harris received about 14 million fewer votes than Joe Biden did 4 years ago. That is a staggering number. And they have a lot of figuring out to do. And that process begins right now to how to rebuild a coalition that seems to be badly fractured.
Yeah, and I think, another part of this, just to not make it exactly everything the Democrats did was wrong, I think there was a ton of disinformation out there. I heard a segment at the end of your show how she needed to separate herself more from Joe Biden because he was so unpopular. Why was he so unpopular? Was his presidency a failure? Can I have an answer on that? Was his presidency a failure, Gene?
No, it was not a failure, actually. Right. He was a very successful presidency, in my opinion. So yeah, right. Look, there will be a whole lot of lessons, I think, for the Democratic Party to learn from this election. I think they might take Joe's advice and go into the trip to France phase for the next couple of weeks, and then really go into the numbers. Why did so many fewer people bother to vote this time? Right. Not just for Harris, but the overall vote totals are lower, and a lot of people didn't show up. That surprised me. And so why was that?
I spoke to people who were canvassing in all the different swing states, some people I knew really well, and they were stunned at how disinformed people were that they were talking to. They were just stunned at what they were saying because it was just beyond even close to the truth. So that's a big part of this. It's not all of it. And Joe, I know we need to get to our other guests, but I just think if we have to, obviously there's a lot of questions that's going to be asked and looked into and really legitimate reasons to look within, for sure. Right. At the same time, the landscape is a sea of voices and websites and places to go for information that is simply not true and then is backed up again and again and again and again until it becomes narrative.
You fight on the battlefield that is before you. And so if there is disinformation on the battlefield that is before you, you can run off of that battlefield screeching and crying with your arms thrown up in the air, or you can figure out how to engage in that battlefield and win. It's that simple. And I understand there is a ton of disinformation out there, and it is sickening. I understand that. I also understand the disinformation will only be worse 4 years from now. So the question is, what will Democrats, or what will independents, or what will Republicans who don't support an authoritarian version of government, what are they going to do right now instead of complaining? Because complaining doesn't get there. Gene,
totally agree.
We showed the numbers. Gene, put the if you can, TJ, put the numbers up of the number of people who voted again, if you will, TJ. You know, right now, Donald Trump sitting at 72 million. I suppose that number will go up as more votes come in from California. But I guess he's probably not going to reach his vote total from last time, which was 77 million. He had 77 million votes last year and still lost, which means a ton of people. Over 10 million people stayed home who voted for the Democrat last time. Over 15 million people stayed home who voted for the Democrat last time. And Gene, reports out of Detroit, reports out of Philadelphia, that the numbers, especially for black voters, were way down. And when we talked to Reverend Al about a week before, he talked about how when he was canvassing in Detroit, there just wasn't the excitement among black voters for this Democratic ticket.
Yeah, there wasn't. And so why was that? And the answer has to be that Democrats were not getting their message through. They certainly didn't get through a sense of urgency to vote, but they, if you don't get the votes, you're not giving people a reason to come vote for you. And so that's the party's got a lot to figure out. I mean, what's going to be when parties get defeated, and this is, this is far from the biggest margin in, this isn't like Reagan in '84 or anything like that. But as John Lemire said, 90% of counties, trending in what for Democrats is the wrong direction, trending in the Republican direction. So when that happens, you need to really look at those numbers, look at yourselves, and figure out what affirmative case you're going to make to people that you're going to make their lives better, and that you understand them, and that you're with them, and that process, I think, probably has already started. It should have, and it will continue. But parties in this situation do tend to figure it out eventually. And, that's where Bill Clinton came from after a Democratic debacle. So we will see this evolution of the Democratic Party over the next couple of years.
Yeah, Willie, Trump even made progress, inroads in deep blue New York City. He still lost it overwhelmingly, but by a much less of a margin than last time around. And as a few Democrats noted to me last night, we simply shouldn't ignore also this was a candidate who was a woman and a woman of color. And for some Americans, they simply weren't ready to do that.
Donald Trump got 30% in New York City. 30%. He got 7% in 2020. Let's bring into the conversation managing editor at The Bulwark, Sam Stein, and author and NBC News presidential historian Michael Beschloss. Guys, good morning. Sam, I'll start with you. Just to pick up and continue this conversation, I was thinking back yesterday to what at the time was viewed as a curious visit by Donald Trump to the South Bronx to have a rally back in May. And a lot of people who didn't get it said, what's he doing there? Well, it's clear what he was doing. He was sending the message to people there, to Latino Americans, to black Americans, that I see you, I hear you, I care about you, I'm here. I may not win. I probably won't win this district. I won't win New York City. I won't win New York State. But I'm taking the time to let you know I see that. And Democratic Congressman Richie Torres, who represents the South Bronx, a Democrat, is very critical this morning and over the last couple of days of the Democratic Party, of the way that they ignored the concerns of Latino Americans. And yes, there may be disinformation out there. Of course there is. But what wasn't disinformation was the fact that groceries and rent and all the things that people need to live their lives every day were still far too high for Americans of every race.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of factors at play here. Obviously, when, 2/3, 3/4 of the country think that the country is on the wrong track, that's not great for the incumbency. Obviously, people felt inflation a lot harder than they felt the rise in their own wages. But on the thing you said about the trip to the Bronx and on the point Joe made about fighting on the battlefield presented, I think one of the things that Democrats specifically, but we generally should recognize, is that Trump was very good at sending cultural signals. That trip to the Bronx wasn't really about winning the Bronx. And to a degree, it was about signaling to those people, hey, I care about you. It was also about creating these types of moments that everyone would consume. It's why he went to Coachella. It's why he went to Madison Square Garden, as problematic as that rally was. It's why he worked a shift at McDonald's. It's why he jumped in a garbage truck and nearly face planted when he couldn't open the door. It's because they wanted to create these moments that everyone would consume on the internet. And frankly, Democrats are not very good at that type of organic content creation. It's notable that the Harris campaign, which admittedly was, short runway and all, a lot of what they were doing was they were bringing creators to their events so that the creators could create the content. They weren't putting Harris in a position where she was creating the content for the creators. And so that was a main distinction. And Joe's absolutely right. I mean, you have to fight on the battlefield where it's presented. And in these postmortems, I know we're just a day in, but virtually every Democrat I've talked to has said, we cannot win if our people are not on these podcasts, these bro podcasts, these right-wing YouTube shows, and Fox News, frankly. Because if all the country is going to get, or a good chunk of the country is going to get their information from those people, if those outlets are going to caricature our candidates, we have to combat that characterization. Last point, and I'll stop talking after that. I thought one of the more interesting moments in this campaign actually took place in the wake of the hurricanes in North Carolina, when there was rampant disinformation, much of it pushed by Elon Musk. And one of the ways in which that disinformation was stopped was when Pete Buttigieg decided to get on the phone with Elon Musk, direct engagement. And suddenly Elon Musk was like, you know what, I talked to Pete Buttigieg. This is actually not happening. We got it fixed. And some of it stopped. I think that's proof positive that you do actually have to engage directly the adversarial sources, or else what they say about you will take root with the voting public.
Yeah, and when you do that, you have to have the answers that make sense to most Americans. So, yeah, were there too many border crossings in 21 and 20? Yeah, there were way too many. There were way too many. We didn't understand. We let it get out. We let it get out of control because we didn't understand just how depressed the situation was in Central America. We didn't understand the number of people going over there. We were caught off guard. And so we turned it around. And after we turned it around, that's when we put this border security bill out there that border agents themselves support. Took us a couple of years to figure it out, and that was terrible. But it will never happen again. We learned from our mistake. Say that. And then, if you're going to go on Fox and they're going to ask you about the 30,000 ads on transgender surgeries for convicts that taxpayers have to pay for, I go, no, I oppose that. I said I supported it in 19. Donald Trump, that was Donald Trump's law of the land. Well, I said it. That was actually his policy. I think we were both wrong. We were both wrong in going for it, da-da-da-da-da. However you want to do it, whatever issue you want to talk about, you got to be able to say it and make sure that you're willing to stand up to the extremes in your party that are pushing an agenda that puts you, according to Reverend Al Sharpton, outside the mainstream of 80% of people, not only in your party, but 95% of the people across America.
Let me just quickly say, I 100% agree with that. And it's the thing that Democrats and that I've been talking to in the past 24 hours, they say their candidates are too worried about misstating something or offending someone or getting it wrong and getting that turned into some sort of viral moment. When in reality, I think Trump, and to a degree Joe Biden actually, have proven that if you create a familiarity with the public, even if you screw up or say something offensive or put your foot in your mouth, the public, if they become familiar with you, will forgive you for that, and they'll move on. And oftentimes, these candidates are too cautious, too scared of offending, and therefore they restrict the types of forums and outlets on which they go.
But let me quote Reverend Al Sharpton right here from this morning. The Democratic Party is led by Beltway insiders and not people on the ground. I exist only as a civil rights leader, and I've lasted as long as I have because there's a huge vacuum that must be filled. And so, you're exactly right. It's the Beltway insiders are the people who were seen as out of touch with middle class, working class Americans, which gets me, Michael Beschloss, to something that's fascinating I read in the New York Times today. And again, people are going there, what are they doing? Why aren't they just saying that Donald Trump is evil? Da, 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 da. You can do that if you want to lose for the next 4 years. You can do that if you want to lose for the next 8 years. This problem at this point is like the party, and whether that's a Democratic Party or whether that's an independent party that fills a centrist role in American politics, because right now only 32% of American support or identify as Democrats. But Michael Beschloss, the voting coalition that Donald Trump put together, and again, I would suggest not because of the things he said and the horrible statements that he said and the anti-democratic, pro-authoritarian statements that he said, but because people were they were trying to get away from Democratic elitists.
Right. I think that's exactly
the coalition that they put together. I'm sorry, I'm still thinking it's Friday, so I'm talking slower today. The coalition they put together.
I'm just agreeing.
Okay, according to the New York Times, was a working class coalition across racial lines. I remember reading a beautiful book written about Bobby Kennedy and after the assassination. And as that train went from New York down to Washington, D.C., and people waving, black people on one side of the tracks waving flags, white people on the other side of the tracks waving flags. I'm sure you saw it. And as that train went past, they turned around and they went their separate ways.
Yeah.
And there has not been an election where they came together and voted again. Now, let's not overstate Donald Trump's support among black voters. He did much better. But make no mistake, among Hispanic voters,
Amazing.
They did come together with working class white Americans. So Donald Trump has, in 2024, put together a working class coalition of white working class voters and working class voters of people of color. And that is something, if the Democratic Party does not think that is something they need to get under the hood over right now, today, this morning, then they are clueless.
Yes, I totally agree with that. And, it's beginning to remind me, Joe, you were showing the map of, blue Democratic areas that won on Tuesday versus the red ones. Look where the blue areas are. The Democrats are in danger of becoming a regional coastal party. The so-called blue wall states, well, they didn't prove to be a blue wall on Tuesday. So you've got states along the West Coast, states along the East Coast, a couple in the northern Midwest, and the Democrats concede everything else and say, we're going to essentially let that go because we're not going to be connected. So the result of that is that every single presidential election now becomes what it did on Tuesday, a Democratic presidential candidate having to thread the needle of making sure that he or she seizes those few potentially Democratic states. And if you lose one or two, and there was more than that on Tuesday, the Democrats are locked out. I'm not going to go so far as to say it's like the 1920s, but, you grew up in the South, not in the 1920s, but in the 1920s, the Democratic Party was a relatively small, white, racist regional party that was centered on the South. It was FDR in 1936 that was able to expand that coalition to the cities to bring in black voters. Black voters before the 1930s were not Democratic. Those were the white racists. Whether we like Donald Trump or don't like Donald Trump or approve of everything he says or doesn't do, you have to give him credit for what he did on Tuesday.
No, absolutely.
This was a red wave.
Yes,
this was a potential, a realignment, a movement that could last into the future. And the other thing is you combine that with his ambition to be the strongest president in American history, plus owning both houses of Congress. How many times did we all say before Tuesday there was probably at least the prospect that the Democrats would control the House if there was a Trump victory? Are the Democrats going to control the House in the next 2 years? It doesn't look that way at this moment. So you've got Trump owning the whole Congress. I don't want to say owning the Supreme Court, but certainly a friendly, compliant Supreme Court, 1/3 of which he appointed, and with a plan to use the Defense and Justice Department and other federal agencies to create more presidential power in the White House than we've ever seen in 2 centuries. That's what we're facing, and anyone who neglects the